From the Broken Wheel Cycle, Volume 1, A Distant Dawn. Epilogue, The Firekeeper, a Warhammer 40,000 story. The crackling of the furnace, the creaking of pipes, the rasp of metal against coal. These were the sounds of Kor's world. His emaciated frame and wrinkled skin rendered a strange dark hue from a life of smoke and soot were surprisingly strong. Seeing the fire begin to lessen, he scooped a large shovelful from the pile of coal just recently left by the monstrous ogren that kept it supplied, and topped up the furnace. The ogrens used to do the job, but they were too blunt, too imprecise. They did not understand the fire like Kor did. He understood the fire, how it needed feeding at just the right moment before the flames grew hungry enough to sputter, how the coal should be placed, not dumped, in careful layers that let air flow between the pieces, how the dampers must be adjusted by touch and instinct rather than gauge or meter, reading the heat against his skin like a language older than words. The furnace shrine sat deep in the void ship's lower decks, in a place where pipes converged and disappeared into darkness both above and below. What they fed, what purpose the fire served, Kor did not know. Perhaps it heated somewhere vital. Perhaps it powered something essential. Perhaps it simply was, the way ancient things simply are, maintained because they have always been maintained. The rituals helped, opening the morning dampers, checking the coal quality. Too much slate and it wouldn't burn clean, too little and it would just smolder. Clearing the ash in the evening and polishing the brass fittings that no one would see. Saying the old words his predecessor had taught him, words whose meaning had long since worn away, but whose rhythm still felt right. Fire given, fire taken, warmth held, darkness shaken. Small words, humble words, but they gave the day's shape. Kor swept the hearth clean with careful strokes, gathering ash into the collection bin. The heat was good tonight, steady, honest. The kind of burn that didn't demand constant attention, just respect. He was reaching for the water dipper, his throat always dry from breathing heat, when he felt it. A presence, vast and silent. Kor turned. The salamander stood at the entrance to the furnace shrine, helmet held in one massive gauntleted hand. Firelight caught the scars that traced across his face. Burns, cuts, the accumulated evidence of wars Kor couldn't imagine. His skin was dark, darker even than Kor's soot-stained complexion, with the strange volcanic quality that marked the sons of Nocturne. His eyes reflected the flames, red-gold and depthless. He was vast, not just tall, though he stood twice Kor's height, but vast in the way mountains are vast. Present, undeniable. Heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with armor or gene-forged muscle. Kor had seen Astartes before. They passed through the lower deck sometimes, their footsteps shaking the gantries. But they never stopped, never paused. They were always moving toward something too important for places like this, for people like him. But this one had stopped. This one stood in the doorway, silent and still, staring into the fire with an expression that Kor, who had spent his life reading flames, recognized. Doubt, uncertainty, the weight of something held too long without rest. Kor didn't speak. What could he say to a being like this? What words existed that could bridge the gap between a furnace tender and a warrior carved from myth? So instead, he did what he knew how to do. He moved to the damper controls, simple iron levers worn smooth by generations of hands, and adjusted them with careful precision. Opening the lower vents slightly, closing the upper ones by degrees, reading the fire's response in the shift of heat against his face. The flames grew brighter, hotter, the kind of clean, fierce burn that drove back shadows and cold, and the emptiness of the void beyond the hull. The salamander's eyes tracked the movement, watched the fire respond, said nothing. Kor stepped back, wiping his hands on the rag he kept tucked in his belt, and considered. In the corner of the shrine, on a small shelf he'd fashioned from scrap metal, sat his few possessions: a blanket, a tin cup, a small burner where he heated water for recaf, real recaf, not the synthetic paste the crew got, but actual grounds he'd traded 3 weeks of saved rations to acquire from a quartermaster who knew a supplier who knew someone else. He'd been saving it. For what? He wasn't sure. Some future moment when he might need comfort more than he needed it now. But looking at the salamander, at the weight in those inhuman eyes, at the way he stood like stone but trembled at some level too deep to see, Kor understood. This was the moment. He turned to his small burner, scooped a careful measure of grounds into the battered pot, added water from his flask, set it to heat while he tended the furnace, keeping the ritual movement of his work steady and undemanding. No expectations, no pressure, just the familiar sounds: coal settling, pipes creaking, the soft bubble of water beginning to boil. When the recaf was ready, dark, bitter, hot enough to burn, Kor poured a measure into his tin cup and another into a slightly larger cup he used for washing tools. He placed the larger cup on the railing beside where the salamander stood, close enough to reach but not so close as to intrude. Then he stepped back to the furnace and took a sip from his own cup, eyes on the flames giving the giant space to choose. Minutes passed, the fire crackled, steam rose from both cups. Kor didn't look, didn't check, just stood in the warmth, present but not demanding. Then movement, massive and careful. The salamander's gauntleted hand reached for the cup. The ceramite fingers, designed to crush and kill, held the crude metal container with surprising gentleness, lifted it. The cup looked absurd in that grip, tiny, fragile, a child's toy in the hand of something built for war. But he drank, a small sip, then another. Then he lowered the cup and held it cupped in both palms, letting the heat radiate into the armor. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Kor, emboldened by this acceptance, said quietly, "Good fire tonight. Clean burn." The salamander's eyes remained on the flames. When he spoke, his voice was deep, resonant in a way that made Kor's chest vibrate, but surprisingly soft. "It is. You tend it well." Kor felt something ease in his chest. He took another sip of recaf, gathering courage, then continued. "Fire's honest. Doesn't pretend to be anything but what it is. Just burns. Just gives warmth. No lies in it." He wasn't sure why he said it. The words came from somewhere deeper than thought, pulled out by the firelight and the strange intimacy of sharing warmth with someone so impossibly far from his world. The flames danced between them. Shadows moved across the metal walls. The void ship hummed its eternal background note. Finally, the salamander spoke again. "No." His voice carried weight. "It doesn't." The salamander stepped closer to the furnace. Not crowding Kor, there was a careful distance maintained, the kind of spatial awareness that came from spending a lifetime being too large for ordinary spaces, but close enough that the firelight painted his scarred features in shades of amber and gold. Kor watched, cup forgotten in his hands. The fire changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way he could point to and say, "There, that." But it changed. The flame seemed to lean toward the salamander. The color shifted, deeper reds, brighter golds, a heat that felt less like burning and more like recognition. The salamander noticed it too. Kor saw the way his eyes tracked the movement, the slight tilt of his head that suggested he was reading something in the flames that went beyond fuel and oxygen and combustion. "You feel it," Kor said quietly, not a question. "Yes." The salamander's voice was soft, almost reverent. "Fire speaks to us, has always spoken to us. Our father taught us to hear it." He extended one gauntleted hand toward the flames, palm open. The fire responded, reaching, dancing, eager, without consuming. "On Nocturne we are tested by fire from childhood," he continued, still watching the flames. "Not to conquer it, not to master it, but to understand it, to recognize what it teaches." "What does it teach?" Kor heard himself ask. The salamander was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried something Kor had not expected from a demigod: uncertainty. That transformation requires sacrifice, that what burns away reveals what endures. He paused, and that even the hottest flame eventually consumes itself. There was weight in those last words, personal weight. Kor took another sip of recaf, considering. Then, "Fire also gives warmth, light, life in the cold places." "Yes," the salamander lowered his hand. "It does. Maybe." Kor hesitated, aware of his presumption but unable to stop the words. "Maybe that's what endures, not the burning, the warmth that remains after." The salamander turned to look at him fully for the first time. Those red-gold eyes studied Kor with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. In the firelight, with soot on both their faces and heat surrounding them, the vast distance between Astartes and Menial felt smaller. "You are wise," the salamander said finally. Kor almost laughed. "No, I've tended fires a long time. You learn things, about what lasts and what doesn't. That is wisdom." The salamander raised his cup in a small gesture, not quite a salute, but an acknowledgement. "Whether you claim it or not." He drank again, finishing the recaf, then held the cup carefully in both hands, as if weighing whether to set it down or keep holding the warmth. Kor returned to his work, not wanting to intrude on whatever the giant was processing. He checked the coal level, adjusted a damper that was running slightly loose, scraped a buildup of ash from the grate. Simple tasks, meditative tasks, the kind that let silence be companionable rather than empty. Behind him he heard the soft sound of ceramite moving against metal. The salamander had set the cup down on the railing with extraordinary care, as if it was something precious. Then the giant's voice, quieter than before. "We deploy in 2 hours. Operation Distant Dawn. Orbital assault on a chaos-held forge world." Kor's hands stilled on the shovel. "Many of us will not return," the salamander continued. "That is acceptable, expected. We are built for sacrifice." A pause. "But I have lost brothers recently, good brothers, and I find myself—" The sentence hung unfinished in the warm air. Kor understood. Not the specifics. He couldn't imagine what it meant to lose brothers forged in the same gene labs, trained in the same trials, bound by oaths he'd never comprehend. But he understood loss, understood the weight of continuing when others had fallen. "The fire will be here when you return," Kor said softly, "burning, waiting." The salamander's head turned slightly. "If I return." "When?" Kor corrected, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Fire recognizes its own. You'll come back." It was absurd, a presumption. What did he know of war or fate, or the survival odds of Astartes in combat? Nothing. Less than nothing. But standing in the warmth, watching the flames dance toward this warrior, like old friends greeting each other, Kor believed it anyway. The salamander studied him for a long moment. Then something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his scarred mouth. "Perhaps," he said. The vox crackle shattered the moment like breaking glass. cold, metallic, demanding. All Salamander elements to Embarkation Deck 7. Operation Distant Dawn Assault commences in 90 minutes. Acknowledge. The Salamander's hand moved to the Vox bead at his gorget. His thumb pressed the activation stud. Acknowledged. Just one word. Flat. Professional. The warrior returning to the surface, submerging whatever had existed in the firelight beneath layers of duty and discipline. He straightened, a movement that seemed to add mass, to restore the mythic distance that had briefly narrowed. The moment of vulnerability, of shared warmth, retreated behind ceramite and gene-forged purpose. But before he turned to leave, he looked once more at the flames, then at Kor. "Thank you," the salamander said. 2 simple words, but weighted with something that made them feel like an oath, for the fire and the warmth. Kor nodded, not trusting his voice. The salamander reached down and carefully, so carefully, lifted the empty recaf cup from the railing. He studied it for a moment, this crude metal thing that had held comfort, then set it back down with reverence. "May your flames burn eternal, Furnace Keeper." Then he turned toward the exit. Each footstep was thunder. Each movement shook the deck beneath Kor's feet. The shadows swallowed him quickly, ceramite green disappearing into the darkness of the lower decks as he walked toward embarkation, toward war, toward whatever waited in the burning skies of a chaos-held world. Kor stood motionless, listening to the footsteps fade. Then there was only silence, the crackling of the furnace, the creaking of pipes, the rasp of metal against coal. The sounds of his world returned.